Hello! Welcome to Why Not Both, the podcast all about how our multiple passions and interests shape our identity and our lives. My name is Pam Schaefer, and I am a musician and therapist in Los Angeles, and I also happen to be your host. This podcast is produced by Laura Studeris, and for this season, we've partnered up with Under the Radar magazine. If you like what you hear, you can hang out with us on social media. We are on Twitter and Instagram at WNB the podcast. And if you really, really like what you hear, please support us on Patreon. We are under Why Not Both podcast. When you join our Patreon, you get a whole bunch of really cool behind the scenes stuff and you get to chat with us. And that's pretty awesome. Thank you so much for your support, and I hope you enjoy our interviews. For this week's episode, we got to spend time with the absolutely wonderful and enchanting Melissa Auf der Maur. I hope that you enjoy our interview. Welcome to Why Not Both, where we are conquering and utilizing technology all at once.
Both analog souls and technological receptors. I'm into it.
Oh my God. I love that. I just looked at my Moog and was just like, can I make that like a tagline that I just stick to it?
Sure.
I absolutely love that. I was curious, your publicist had sent along like wonderful stuff about the Basilica Hudson, and I was like, I actually have so many questions about that, but I was like, I'm curious what you would want to speak to, just even like right off the bat, about what it is and explain it to other humans who don't have a cheat sheet.
Right. Basilica Hudson is so layered. It's the biggest life project I've been involved in. I guess second to that was bass player for Hole for 5 years. So this is kind of my second major band, but it's so weird and different because it's not a band, and it's a gigantic 1880s factory in upstate New York, on the banks of the historic Hudson River, framed by the Catskill Mountain Range. And it's this very unexpected twist of fate and turn of events in my life, where I spent a long time on the road with rock bands, and then I had this moment where I fell in love. I was in the middle of making my second solo album, and I had moved back to Canada after a good chunk in the United States during my rock band days. And then I fell in love with a New Yorker, and I said, I'm not moving back to New York City. And he brought me to this area in upstate New York, the Hudson Valley. Mm-hmm. And I had this instant reaction after touring the world of major cities, but never going to the places in between. It captured me very quickly, these small little cities in rural areas of the United States. And I had this it's as if I'd been looking for a reason to fall in love with the US, because I had always sort of had an aversion, being born and raised in Montreal, to actually an American mother who left the US in the 60s because of the Vietnam War and racism and all the things that have always plagued this country. And I'd had this sort of love-hate relationship with the place, and this Hudson Valley region just captured my heart. It was also the geographical in-between Montreal and New York City. So we landed here as two artists, me as a musician and him as a filmmaker, and completely accidentally fell in love and into this gigantic factory behind our house. So we had bought this little house in Hudson, New York, and through our back windows, we overlooked this beautiful historic factory that had been sitting dormant since the 80s. And we had heard that this eccentric man had bought it. He was kind of like a pre-Burning Man, large-scale spectacle artist who also had a dream for community building and part of the Rudolf Steiner kind of collective movements in the U.S. And we introduced ourselves and said, would you ever like to bring music or film to this building? It's so beautiful, and it's just this gorgeous building that people have to go to the website just to see the building. It hard to not fall in love with the building itself. And then next thing we know, this very mystical, strange man said that he actually believed we were the next chapter, and that he'd had it for a decade, and but had a vision for it being this bustling place of the people and arts, culture, community. So he made us an offer we couldn't refuse, and he offered to hold the mortgage for this gigantic building. And anyhow, we ended up in 2010 accepting this strange offer to, like, this one in a lifetime opportunity of take this gigantic factory in this industrial wasteland with this glorious historic view wrapped around it, panorama of this like rural gorgeousness at the edge of this beautiful town. Hudson, New York is one of the most historic preserved towns in upstate New York. And it was just storybook weird of just, okay, we're going to do it. What are we doing with this factory? And for the last decade, we built the simple version of it is it's a platform for independent and innovative voices and arts and culture with a strong environmental advocacy action component that it is getting more so as the climate catastrophe encroaches. So we went solar right away in the first year. We've done a lot of environmental. The Hudson Valley region is the birthplace of the modern day environmental movement. Thanks to, among others, Pete Seeger, the folk musician, started a big Hudson River awareness and cleanup in the 60s and 70s because GE had polluted and dumped all their toxins into this river for decades. So it was the first time that a serious movement of the people happened to protect the planet. The first time it had happened was this Hudson Valley region is also the birthplace of the first documented American arts movement, which is the Hudson River School painting movement, who were reacting to the industrial era 100 years earlier in the 1800s and going to the land, and they're like naturalists and landscape painters. So there's a long legacy of environmental protection here that I was not aware of because I was not up on my U.S. history. And I was very much like a globe traveling transient. And the moment I arrived here, I became embedded in American history, and I became fascinated by the Hudson River, which was the original gateway to all the European explorers. Yeah. So once they hit the coast, it was one of the first gateways inland to the different trade routes, to the exploration of the indigenous cultures. So it's just very like the history of America I can see out of my back window, and it's littered with like the ghosts of the native people in this beautiful landscape. It's then littered with like industrial relics of giant power lines, dilapidated factories. And then the Amtrak train routes came in the 1850s and 80s and created all these strange landfills. And so I'm looking at my window right now, and as a Montrealer who traveled the world, who then found herself kind of nestled in this rural, historic, strange land, I've been obsessed for over a decade. And that's what I've been doing, is trying to bring like the parts that I loved about my cultural independent world growing up in Montreal, where I'm sure people who are listening know that Canada has a strong support of the arts and culture. And so I grew up in a very bustling, bohemian, alternative, independent arts culture world. Both my parents were very active in the political, cultural, and artistic world of Montreal. So I always was sad about the U.S. lack of little cultural havens, and then you have big cities like New York and LA and Chicago that are just, gigantic, and obviously banks own them and real estate developers own them. So when you get into the places in between, you get into this sort of like choose your own adventure, build your own dreams of independent thinkers, and you're away from the corporate strongholds. And anyway, and so what ended up happening is we founded this place, and our 10-year anniversary was in 2020, and it was marked by a crazy pandemic, and we had to shut down, and we've been kind of reflecting and reviewing ever since, because the world has changed tremendously since 2010, and not just in COVID, of course, but like, as I mentioned earlier, the climate catastrophe is constantly on my mind, but also social media, digital realities, more and more corporate interests in absolutely everything, every neighborhood, every artist, every industry. So I really ended up kind of like burrowing in this little pocket of the US, trying to imagine or explore if you can create cultural independent havens. I've been trying in one little like corner of town, and it's been a remarkable learning curve of what it is to work on a small scale, and what it is to work with neighbors and communities and small elected official landscapes. And it's been fascinating, and that's what I've been doing. So Basilica Hudson is a multidisciplinary art center in a reclaimed 1880s factory on the banks of the Hudson River in the Hudson River Valley region. And our events range from music festivals, artist in residencies, film screenings, green energy fairs, large-scale farm and flea markets. And it really is all, even though I just said everything about like the landscape of America and independent and corporate interests, but it really is about the building. The building is the muse. She kind of commands the whole programming. You really are moved by the architectural grace and the standing power that this thing has stood through all these changing of historic moments and industries, boom and bust economies all over this kind of upstate region that has been in steady decline for a long time until about now. COVID actually has just bumped this development up here, all the US, the New York City exodus. Everyone kind of like ran up here.
Yeah.
So it's just it's super fascinating. I mean, the land, it's just endlessly. It's teaching me a lot about humanity. So this is what I'm doing.
It was wonderful when you said, and it's not a band. I was just like, oh, that's like an Uber band. That's all the bands. It's a super band of multiple cultures and timelines and all sorts of things just coalescing. It's so interesting when you were talking, I was thinking about the power of the places that sometimes we go that unexpectedly might not feel exactly quite like home in the way of like, oh, I'm returning to a home, but home in the way of I'm supposed to be here. And like, I love how you said like a storybook way. Where you know that it's like, oh, this is actually where my purpose is right now. And it just like captivates you. You're like, okay, here's where I shall stay. That's fascinating also to hear about how the building itself and also like the history of the landscape has been informing what you're doing in the space. Like it sounded almost like the fortune teller at the beginning of The Wizard of Oz, like own the space. Like that's how I see that person in my mind. He's just telling prognostications to Dorothy and she's like, what now? And then he's like, run home.
Oh, I forgot about that. Yeah, I forgot that opening. Well, actually, the magical wizard-like guy that made us the offer to buy the building from him, we had invited him to our house to show him the view of his building from our upstairs balcony. And I remember we had just moved into this house in this town within that year, and we were standing on this blustery day, and I said, "Look at that building! Isn't it such a beautiful view from our house?" And he like literally almost like magic dust came from his fingertips, and he sort of like waved his hand across the landscape and said, "Melissa, this is your oracle." And I didn't know him, and I looked at him and I And I'm into cosmic, spiritual, psychedelic stuff. So I really liked it, but I had no idea to what extent he meant that when he said that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's how I imagined him, strangely enough. And I was like, yeah, scans.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
It's been very fascinating though to be so landlocked, well, for someone like me who traveled and traveled and traveled and traveled and never had a permanent home since I left the house I grew up in with my family.
yeah.
So I was just, I almost overcompensated and over grounded myself because of my decade plus of transientness. So I almost I gave my all to a location in a building, and it's a very kind of strange now coming out of a decade. And I've always been one to really work in decade chapters. And I'm kind of coming out of it like a 10-year dream of what happened. Like it was truly like going through a gateway of just go, keep going. And then I didn't mention that simultaneously to buying the building, I got pregnant. And part of the fit there was that I didn't want to be on the road as a mother, and I wanted to lock myself. So I built this anchor of this building so that I would raise my daughter alongside it. And I'm coming into this decade of her turning 10, the art center turning 10, and me coming into this decade milestone of both, and realizing how, and anyone who's been a mother, and especially in the first decade, it is like this womb, like you get lost in this complete, like emotional, murky survival, connection, panic, isolation. It's really, they're very similar. And when we had our belated 10-year anniversary for Basilica and my daughter's birthday simultaneously, a lot of my friends said, well, wow, you really have two babies. And and I would never want to insult my daughter to do, that like this building is her sibling, but it really is, because it is much bigger than a building. It's been this organism that I pumped all of my love of traveling the world and all of the things that all the interests and all of the new things I discovered while living here. I had like a palette and a place to channel those things in. And it's a very, I'm waking up out of a very intense decade, and it's cool to talk about it from this place and not say like 5 years ago when I was in the middle of all of it. It was very different.
Yes. And that, I love what you said about how you'd kind of almost like stored up I don't know how to put it other than you'd stored up all of this magic that you'd collected from around the world. You'd been like wandering, seeing all these things and taking all of this in, but then you actually had two places to channel it, which I was like, what a gift to both the daughter and to the space, that I was just like, oh, then if you can take all of that and put it into both of those, I was like, that's beautiful. Like both are so fortunate.
Well, what's so interesting is that at one point, because when we started our nonprofit component, we first started really like DIY art center, hand to mouth, sell tickets, pay for the staff, pay for the band, But then 5 years ago, we had been told for years, everything you're doing is nonprofit worthy. You really should consider creating a nonprofit and getting funding for what you're doing. And so 5 years ago, we started a nonprofit, which is a whole other beast in itself. It's very different than like running like a venue or, and so we have a board of directors, and we have a volunteer group of kind of a moral barometer that's keeping a sense of what the initial mission was and how we're evolving with the time and what we offer the community, what grants we apply for. So, we have like New York State Council of the Arts support our free film screening series. Our artist in residency is supported by the National Endowment of the Arts. So we slowly started getting kind of like art center nonprofit-y, which is a very heavy load of paperwork, which has actually been kind of the tipping point of, oh, wait a second, I didn't know I was getting into art administration. But at the same time, what's interesting is that we had started very DIY, and then we like grew and grew. And one of my first board members said, in that first year, he said, but I want to remind you, Melissa, you're a creative traveling spirit, and we don't want you to empty that vessel. If you don't keep going out into the world and collecting the inspiration and the work, it will be a disservice to the art center. So don't forget your creative path. And because motherhood and like nonprofit selfless art centerhood came simultaneously, a lot of mothers will know you get into this like tapped out, accidental, selfless, you completely empty yourself. Like, and especially around when child turns 10, I've, spoken to many mothers that like you start like all of a sudden hitting like a burnout thing. So that definitely happened to me. And right around COVID, and COVID was this incredible reprise of just stop all the events, even though it was right in the middle of our 10-year anniversary year, and we had to cancel all of our big celebrations. So it was this gift of quiet. And my little family, my daughter and husband, took off to a little mountain town in Western Canada to really kind of replenish, and mainly to offer our daughter in-person school and a little adventure, because we had been so landlocked. But I've come back home in a very kind of conflicted place where I realize I actually do have to get back to the creative, because I'm saying it because what you pointed out, I collected all this magic around the world and with all these collaborations, and I just kept giving it to the art center in the best of ways. All the musicians I had met along the way, all the music organizers, and like all of our festivals are collaborations between creative people that I've met along the way, and all the bands and artists I've invited. It's just been such a cool way to invite people that I know to Hudson. I also saw it as an exciting kind of a cultural exchange, is bring artists from afar to this small town that otherwise wouldn't have these kinds of avant-garde art happenings. But the interesting thing now is I realize I actually have to go back to the creative magic place so that the next decade can, and you were saying that I had all this magic stuff from around the world that I could give my daughter and my factory. And I actually feel depleted. And I realize that if right now, the factory and my daughter kind of have this whole new world of magic, of life lessons and maturity and sacrifice and challenge that I now want to bring into my work. So I want to take that and bring it. And so I'm writing my memoir. I started a writer's workshop in the middle of the pandemic, and it's a year-long memoir in a year writer's workshop. And I'm reflecting on, I also was a photographer originally. I was actually in photo school when I joined Whole, and I never stopped taking photos until digital cameras took over. I never have used digital cameras, but I'm archiving my tens of thousands of 35 millimeter negatives and going through all of my diaries and all of my correspondence. And I'm starting at the beginning of my creative venture and coming from the mature, sort of tapped out person now. And I'm looking at the 20-year-old that fearlessly picked up the bass, somehow got myself into a world traveling rock band within a year of committing to music. And I'm looking to her as a teacher to get back into my creative place and fearlessness so that I can build up again, build the magic, the creative energy, and give back to my community and my daughter from that. So there it is. That's my whole story.
I was like, for one, that's the jacket of your memoir, of looking back at that 20-year-old and being like, okay, what does she have to teach me? That's amazing, by the way.
Yeah.
To be like 1 year in, to be like, okay, now I'm in Whole. I was like, well played.
No, seriously, I've been like kind of like reviewing from here. Like, how did I do that so quick? And how it was just so, oh, it was, and so that fearless 20-year-old, and I work with a lot of younger people, and I'm definitely like young at heart, older woman. And I've been just excited to tell them, I'm like, you in your 20s right now are going to be your teacher in your 40s and 50s. Like, just go wild, be as wild and amazing as you can be right now, because your future self is going to need it later.
Yes.
To inspire yourself again.
Yes. And it's so interesting. A friend of mine just turned 30, and I'm kind of like in that awkward generational stage that I believe they've now called us elder millennials, which
oh, okay.
we're geriatric millennial, the Oregon Trail generation. Like you're
the semi analog, like those who still had a moment, or like a mini analog millennial.
Yes. And it's like much like you said at the beginning of like what did you say? It was so beautiful. It was about like the digital and analog. That was basically, I think that spoke to me so much, because that's like my childhood and my experience of just like, oh, you have like, a Betamax VCR at home, but then you're learning how to like type on like the Apple IIe. So it's like you're in between these worlds. And it's funny because my friend just turned 30, and I said to her, I was just like, oh, your 30s are amazing. It's kind of like you have all of the same like weird ideas that you had in your 20s, but you actually have more tools to like activate them. And she's like, well, how do you feel about like, because I'm going to be in my 40s soon. She's like, how do you feel about being in your 40s? And I was like, I kind of feel like it's the time when like my field of fucks will be completely fallow. And that's so exciting, because I'll have all the ideas from my 20s, all the tools from my 30s, and I won't care what people think anymore at all.
That's for sure. That is for sure. Yep.
So I'm just like, I feel as though we only grow more powerful.
It's true. Until our bodies start giving out is the only problem. But yeah.
Therein lies, yes.
That's it.
Therein lies the only.
So that's when the soul, starts transcending beyond the body, and the spirit gets even stronger. You start letting go of the mind and the body. It's super cool. We are very lucky to have this short vessel to explore what it is to be human in. It's very radical.
Yeah, and when you said that about like that we're in this vessel, it kind of reminded me of when you were even talking about being in the factory and being in the Hudson Valley and like the eras of that space. I was like, oh, that's a really interesting parallel, that you had then delved into the history of that space and the eras of that space while you're in the midst, like you said, that you're taking this memoir course and writing this memoir. I was like, oh, you've got parallel history things going on there.
Yeah, it's fun. Yes. And it's been very cool to see that relationship between a time and a place, like a geographical location, and then your position in it, your like node in this like moment in time in that place. And yeah, it's very, very, I mean, I guess that's like what's interesting about being so locked to a location as opposed to a transient person. You kind of it's like watching the tree grow next to you. It's like you're watching history get manifested on a physical level as well as your conceptual time level.
And I'm sure that must inform a lot of what you talked about the unfolding climate disaster, and thus the focus on climate justice.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, much because I learned about the history of the area, and I hadn't realized that first art movement was really a wave of naturalists who were rebelling against the early 1800s industrialization. And then our factory came at the industrial peak of the following century, turn of the century. And those artists had already been warning, like, these industrial factories in Europe are coming. They're going to destroy our American landscapes. Be careful. So I've been fascinated that there was an artistic premonition of the industrial disaster, and then came like the cultural movement of the 60s and 70s and the all the social justice components of that generation were born here, reacting to all these industrial factories that had come to the banks at the turn of the last century. And it's just been incredible to kind of just use one place to learn about those movements, which I'm sure are happening simultaneous all over the globe in all the different ways that they happen. But to take a moment and just look at one location and unpeel those layers, and simultaneously have an art center that you can select those stories to be presented in film or panels, or it's really amazing. It's been like a very, like, I said at the beginning, it's not a band, but it's like this really weird version of an arts project, collage, performance art, very odd palette. Like it's a strange platform to be working on, but it's been, and especially as a bass player, photographer, it's not what I expected, but it's very much what I'm still taking all the same components, but this time very informed by the location, as opposed to, say, in my world of rock music, I was kind of just taking it from like a female existence and a woman's perspective on love, the world, the male-dominated landscape of rock music, like that. That was my time and space then, and then just plop me in a different place, and being a kind of hypersensitive antenna that I am, just tapped into this thing.
It was interesting that even when you said like it was feminine, I was like, both actually struck me like, and I was thinking feminine in like the Jungian way, as opposed to like the like men are from Mars, women are from Venus, weird like 90s ice way. More of like the receptive, the intuitive, like that kind. And it sounds like you were able to tap into that in both kind of spheres. And I was like, I love that you were open to that in both ways, that in like the male dominated rock in the traveling sphere, you were open to receiving and intuiting what to do next. And then you landed here and you were like, oh, I'm going to do the same thing, but it's almost like an inverse location, but same reaction. That makes sense.
That makes sense to me. I don't know if anyone listening is going to understand, but I totally understand, because it's basically like, no, I'm not a bass player, I'm just a receiver. Like I'm just a receiver. And that's, a very feminine situation, not only because of like literally physiological vaginal receptors, they're whatever like makes women sometimes have literally a receptor that then grows something. It's definitely I guess if I really, and maybe focusing on that decade of women in rock in the 90s and my magical, very fairy tale like arrival into that world, it was very, very mystical and not at all expected as well, but just also very, very storybook. It doesn't make it in there, although I'll definitely be having like a newly informed understanding of that way that I intuited decisions and locations and how I got to where I was going, because I know myself better now, but I've also seen it through this other strange lens. If I go to another place and I do this completely similar process, but a radically different project, is I would suspect that at some point I will really probably want to hone in, and it feels like it's part of like what I was saying earlier of like the soul getting older and you transcending your body and your mind to get to this like more spiritual place that prepares you for death or something. Not that I'm planning on dying young at all, but I really feel like tapping into what that art form is or that creative process is something I'd like to be able to articulate a bit more in my lifetime, of like what that is to receive and process, because I feel like, as we know, like, organized religion has sort of failed and crumbled for a lot of people, and like I've always said, music is my religion or my spiritual practice. But then I got into like being an art center founder, and like the creating the space and the shared experience in person is my ritual now, and is my, which is not unlike performing for a live audience, but it's sort of like this idea of like, what is that sacred space and what process do you take to get there, is I think probably what I'm beginning to hone into of what it is that I do, and do like almost obsessively, or well enough that I end up like really manifesting real things in the outside world from it.
Yeah, and it's that expression of, in a way, like my brain went, oh, it's an expression of will. Like it's that you're bringing forth something and that you're receptive to what's coming to you, and that like people get really rigid about like what that thing has to be. And I appreciate that you're like,
right,
I am flexible with my ritual for this. Like that it doesn't have to be
exactly. No, it's true, because that logic place of like, I want to be a successful painter, or I want to be a, you know, I exactly, that might be part of the kind of like magic component, is the flexibility. And I remember in the 90s even being more so this kind of like, now everybody like makes movies and music on their laptop, so everyone can do everything now. But at the time when I joined Whole and I explained I was a photographer, I literally remember journalists being like, well, are you a musician or a photographer? I said, well, I'm both. I'm anything. I'm everything. I'm going to continue to be many things. Exactly. Like I really didn't like that I was being made into a musician. I was like, well, I went to an art school where I studied visual art, performance art. I mean, I do anything. The whole, you know, and that's when that, you know, Renaissance man or Renaissance. But I always felt very, very kind of surprised by even the music, the rock scene. It's like really everyone was a rock musician. I always became friends with like the photographers that took our pictures or the music video directors, because I always saw everything as multidisciplinary. I just happened to be on a bass and in a band at that time. And I definitely have always been a supporter of multidisciplinary. I mean, and now I feel like the whole world is kind of multidisciplinary, but I feel like in the 1900s, it was even more rigid of like, you go to school for one thing, or you drop out for one thing and you go self-train as I don't know. I think the 21st century and technology, obviously being a massive extended tool to everything, has really changed that black and white thing. Just like remote working and COVID, like all of a sudden it's like, oh wait, maybe real jobs aren't going to offices. Oh right, maybe I'm definitely a freelancer. You know, I've always been a freelancer, that's for sure. My parents. But like I was raised by freelancers. So between me going to a like multidisciplinary art school my whole life from grade 1 on, and my parents being freelancers who never had a boss ever, I was like built for adapting to whatever, anything, all the time. Because
like it's so interesting that you say that, because like thinking about being in that cusp generation, there was something that like didn't make sense to me of how to get to like where I was as like a child and a teenager to where I saw that we were, quote, supposed to be, like you said, like that rigid, like one job, one purpose, one thing. Like I had never understood how to, and I remember pondering this like mid high school, people would always ask like, you know, like, well, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And I didn't understand how I would get from where I was, which was making music in like the synth lab with my friends and counseling them through their problems and taking pictures and making art, to whatever like a desk job was. Like I genuinely get it. Yeah. Like I was like, where do we make that leap? And so I just low-key never made that leap. I know right. I never did, because I didn't understand how to even bridge that gap or what it meant. But it was funny because I was actually raised by 2 lawyers. And so like I was in government as a kid of like, you know, going to the courthouse with them and being at their office. And I understood what the job of a lawyer like was, but I didn't understand how to get even from where I was to even something like that. Like that even seemed like just like a insurmountable distance to cross. And so
were they, I mean, the environment in which you're raised is like key to how you start relating to how you're going to get there. I mean, that's like a big, I mean, your role models of your parents and their friends is central to like one's conceiving their life decisions. And I definitely, over the years and years, the interviews about my different chapters in music, I always said that I always declared my parents as two of my biggest inspirations because of how independent and self-directed they were, but also as parents, the greatest thing they did was never, ever told me, even suggested what I was going to be or who I was or how to get there. Zero.
Wow.
It was just complete free reign. Never, ever even asked. Just, I was on my journey. I was my person. And they didn't have a lot of money. They were freelancers. But if I said, hey, I'm really interested in photography, my mother would go to a secondhand store and she bought me a secondhand camera. I was like, here, try it. And then I remember saying I really love music, and my father came with me to the pawn shop and got me a really cheap bass. And those were that's what my parents did, is just listen to what I suggested or wanted and just let me do it myself. And that's definitely what I have to remember as a mother to my daughter, is that that sense of being empowered to make your own thing and find yourself, and that only you know who you are, is so key. And I think that a lot of the world of the narrative that people have overlay on everyone's life and on their children's life of, well, you have to go to school, and if you don't, or go to a private school this, you go to public school this, just
yeah.
Less is more on that, in terms of, because especially now the world is insane. The future is so uncertain, so unpredictable, and things are moving so quickly that a 10-year-old girl might have a better sense of what the future is going to be like than we do.
I was so curious about is, what is it like looking through her eyes? What is it like being a parent and seeing all of this through hers? Because what a beautiful gift your parents gave you to be able to be empowered, and that they would give you the tools. I love that you said they listened. I was just that's a beautiful skill as a parent, because some parents have a hard time doing that.
Yeah.
And so I was so curious,
Yeah.
what is it like seeing things through your daughter's eyes, especially now at 10? That's she's starting to become a lot more independent. And I'm oh, has she gotten metacognition yet? I love that when kids turn preteen and all of a sudden they can think about how they think and reflect upon it. And it's you watch them just skyrocket into the same kind of cognitive process that adults have, and you're whoa.
No, it's very heavy right now. In fact, she's at the office with me right now because we're skipping school because she doesn't like her new school. We came back from Canada. We put her in a new school. Schools have just been crazy for every child out there right now, COVID, and some people moved around, some people were remote, so everything is kind of little very very weird for children, and they're finding a stable and easy to engage, and they're still we're at a Waldorf school where it's all outdoors and there's no desks, and it's all very free range wild right now because of this COVID thing. And she's been doing it as best she can, but I decided to take her out of school for the week because her will of explaining, you don't understand. I do not like this school. I'll try anything else.
Oh.
And I realized, even though we have to be in school and we're enrolled in this, and we will finish most likely this year here, but giving her a few days to just empower her voice because that's really a small thing like that goes a long way of listen. Because she actually said, on Monday morning when she was crying, and she said, you don't care about my happiness, you only care about me going to school. Aww. And I brought her to school, and then at noon I had this flash and said, you know what, I gotta listen to that. And I went to school and picked her up at lunch. She's like, why are you here? I said, because I realized, I heard after you left, I heard what you're saying, and I want to listen more, River. And she said, well, you've never been a very good listener, so thank you. And I said, okay, well, let's take the next few days to really just hang out together, and I'm going to learn to listen better.
Oh, I'm what? Yeah. Kids are the most brutal call out. It's just
oh.
I was like, damn, River.
Yes. Especially because then I'm like, well, let me tell you about when I was in school. Then it's just like, I don't want to hear about your life right now. This is my life we're talking about. I was like, oh, also good point. Okay. Anyway, it's fascinating. I mean, we've had a couple of good few wacky days because I'm like, well, I'm going to go to work. I'm going to do stuff. You're going to draw and play. And I don't know. But yes, it's a big turning point as a mother at this age for sure. And especially COVID really, really either majorly held back or pushed forward children in a variety of ways, because of, well, the anxiety was just, pretty weird. And some people were hyper isolated and alone with their parents. And then we had decided to do this great Canadian adventure, went to a place with no COVID, and she had this not only COVID-free, like full year as a like normal child enrolled, but in a place she had never been and never knew anyone. So we had like a full like get to know yourself in a brand new space and full experience. And I'm so grateful that for my 2 passports and having made that happen for her. But it's a very odd time for child development, COVID.
Well, and also like, it sounds like in a way by doing that, you empowered her to be able to say what she said, to just be like, I know that this isn't for me, because then she actually had something to compare it to and was like,
exactly.
Like,
no,
this
I know
thing is not my jam. Like, and now I know how to articulate that.
Exactly. It's pretty cool. Weird, wild responsibility to raise a human being. And I can't believe, I remember when the first week I had her, I had like woke up in a panic of, oh my God, is everything okay? And I realized it should be illegal for just anyone to have a baby, because this is really, wow, this is like very high stakes when you have a tiny being in your house.
Oh my God. I love how you put that. That was my best friend has expressed similar things, where like, even when we became friends when we were like 12, and then close when we were 15, and have been close ever since. And it's like, she always wanted to be a mom and I always wanted to be an aunt. And so it's just like, great, good team. And so when she had her baby, it was like the same thing. And he's 3.5 now. And thankfully, like, I'm good friends with her husband as well. It's like, we're all very close, and they live like 15 minutes away. But it's like,
nice.
It was so funny because, like, helping her out when he was so small, it's like I'd go over just so she could like take a shower or rest or things like that. And like the first time we actually went out together, we went to go get cupcakes, and because those are her favorite. And she just says to me with this wild look in her eyes, she's just like, I feel like a free Julian Assange. Like, she was just like, who lets this be a thing? How has this ever been a thing? What is this?
Yep. I mean, it's full. I had a very, very big heart-to-heart years ago with one of my dear female friends who was on the contemplation of abortion, not abortion. She was calling me as another creative who also traveled with their work, and calling to say, I'm really torn. I don't know if I can do it. If I do it, do I have to change everything? And I really, like, I was aware of the responsibility I had to give an answer that would be of weight in this person who was having a very lost, fearful moment of either one. Scary to have a baby, scary to have an abortion, both terrifying. And I really, like, I had to remember just going so deep, because I love this woman. I wanted to give her like the closest thing I could to the absolute truth of what it has been for me to be a mother. And I just felt like going into the layers, past like the fear, the no time, the, oh my God, the career that you're not doing, just kept going and going. And then I went into this like center of my being, and felt at that point, I guess River would have been 5 years old, and feeling the morphing transformation that is a motherhood. And I said to my friend, well, I don't think everyone has to have a baby by any means, and I was never sure I was going to. But now that I do have one, I can tell you the one thing that motherhood does that in a different way than anything else is massive transformation. You will never be the same. Zero. Like it just like it pulls you inside out, turns you. And I said, I'm not saying that every person needs that transformation in their life, but it is the experience, is complete metamorphosis, transformation. And I would say that's the kind of deciding factor of, do you want that? Do you not want that? It's it's very abstract, but it's ultimately, and she actually had an abortion, and then she had a baby 2 years later, and now we talk about it much fuller because she feels it, and we're talking about that transformation. It's really just unexplainable. And so terrifying and so hard, but so beautiful because it's radical, way beyond yourself. It's way beyond what you're capable of doing alone. I mean, unless you're like a deep, like plant-based medicine shaman meditator, I don't know what. Maybe you could do that.
I wonder about that because especially when my brain flipped back to when you were talking about kind of that transformation that our soul and our energy goes through as we go through the life cycle. And it's like that, where there are things that bring about this radical change. And some of them are slow, gradual, radical change. And some of them are like motherhood, where it's like, it's going to change you whether you want it to or not. Like it's like switch gets flipped, and that creative force you were talking about, I did notice that in my friend. Go on.
There's the other metamorphosis is puberty. And now that I have a 10-year-old daughter who's not in puberty, and I was a very late puberty person, and hopefully she will be too. The later, the better, the more advanced your mind, because like what a radical thing to happen then. I mean, can you remember when your body is like starting to like grow things? It's freaky.
Oh my
God. And so
God.
it's that times like, so you're like, grow this thing, and then it leaves your body, and then you watch it grow and then go through puberty. It's crazy. But it's super, I mean, it's very kind of alien. It's a physical transformation thing, which is again why I don't know that you could do that through even the most radical, like ceremonial, plant-based wild journeys. I don't know that you could, because it's like a cellular level on such a deep scale. I don't know. Where are we now? Where are we? We're talking.
Welcome to Chatting on Why Not Both with me, who has a galaxy brain. It's so funny. It's so cute when publicists are like, so what's your plan? I'm like, that's really adorable that you think I have a plan. That's very that's
yeah.
I was like,
no, that's good. I have.
Yes. Like my whole agenda is just, I like to talk to interesting people about things. That's it. That's the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
You were saying on like a cellular level, like I was thinking about even how that then informs what you choose to do after you have a child. Like it's fascinating that then your focus turned to Basilica Hudson. And also now that there is that transformation on like the precipice of puberty, that you're like, I think I'm actually ready to like go back into the world outside and kind of I'm just like, it's like synchronous life cycles, which is really interesting to witness throughout your story.
Exactly. It's and again, that's just, I guess, what we were talking about earlier of just being a kind of psychic receptor of let the world, to a point that maybe is bad, that I change with the seasons. Like I do evolve. It's the opposite of rigid. And that's definitely my kind of specialty, is like listening to the messages, shifting. But I'm definitely on the precipice of the major change right now. It's very exciting. Oh, and so is the building. So here I am. My daughter is 10. The building turned 10 last year, and tomorrow we're having a groundbreaking ceremony for the Basilica Hudson Net Zero campus renovation that begins this month. And over the next 2 years, our 1880s, rough around the edges, seasonal art center will become a state-of-the-art, all year round, fossil fuel free, like spaceship museum art thing. It's going to be so exciting. We worked for years and years to get these incredible New York State grants, specifically the ones for renewable energy and innovative building. So it's going to be it's a historic green rehabilitation of the building. And we've gotten several grants from different sources because we're both in the green and historic, and New York State is actually very good with a lot of their renewable and green infrastructure grants, but they're also very good with preservation of historic buildings. But then we've also gotten little grants from the creative economy, economic development councils who offer spaces, little upgrade opportunities so that they can expand their audience, etc. So we're embarking on a 2-year physical transformation of the building, right as my daughter is embarking into her turning 12 in the next few years. So it's very synchronized and weird. So by the time we are pristine Tesla battery storage, tons of heating and cooling in this big dusty old factory, it's going to become airtight and just beautiful and much more conducive to museum grade stuff. Right now we do a lot of it's a lot of music. The place is indestructible in a cool way because it's just steel, brick, concrete. But it's going to be very different, and so will my daughter be when she's turning 12 and 13. So yes, we're continuing to evolve with these two entities. But it's an exciting moment that we're really on a precipice of that. And as the building changes, and I had always said that the building was the muse for all of our arts programming. So when we were focusing on art installations, musicians, and different kinds of conceptual music festivals, it would always be about what does the building want and what kind of art comes in and is enhanced by this building and what enhances the beauty of the building. And now it's evolving into the building as the teacher, is that we want to be a learning center for ecological, obviously climate action, in that infrastructure is key. Getting off of fossil fuels is one of the most required actions to cap and contain and to hit some of these emission goals. So the building went from being a muse for art to a teacher in essentially social science of, we need to, as humans, take responsibility for our waste and our energy use and our buildings. And we want this inspiring building to be a learning opportunity, whether it's bringing, we're exploring ability to do training in the green trades, historic green trades of local underserved citizens who are not going to college or finding pathways to real jobs. Right now, the Hudson Valley is very kind of service industry, tourist-based economies, which is, as everyone knows, not really good, long, sustainable jobs. And then a lot of people in certain class or demographic are not getting those jobs. So we're developing a green trades program, but we also see it as an opportunity of bringing high school students and youth through the building and showing them, because this building is impressive no matter what age you are or what. It is a vessel of remarkable engineering and architecture and design and materials. But then when you also then show them this Tesla battery and these chargers, and so that we're really excited about what the building can just become, this sort of walking teaching. And then also that the humans who own and run the building felt the responsibility to do this, because climate change is going to affect all of us. Doesn't matter what class, what demographic, what race, where you are geographically. I mean, some of us will be luckier than others in terms of our geographic location, but this, it is here, it is happening, and climate and social justice are completely aligned, because obviously those who are rich enough to go into their bunkers with their supplies will,
Right.
but those who are living on the edge of like waterfronts with industrial pollution and rising waters, and not to mention all the third world countries around the world and all the migration that will be happening from all these inhabitable places. So climate action is social action as well. And so that's, the next decade for us is really allowing the building to tell that story. We obviously are both artists. We believe that the beauty and connectivity that art brings is essential to inspiring and communicating, but we also want to take it further into actual education about real time, place, and science and technology, and the ripple effect it has on human cohabitating this planet. Yeah. So that's the evolution for Basilica, and it's a very, very different direction we're going in, but kind of amazing because we had an amazing decade of very unique programming. I'll give you a snapshot. One of my personal favorite programs that we do at the Basilica that kind of changed and ended with COVID in some ways is 24-hour drone experiments and sound in music. It's a 24-hour immersive experimental music festival where we create a tapestry of 24 hours of sound in the center of the building, and up to 600 people spend the 24 hours transforming with the lights, with the sound, and with each other. And it's really one of my most favorite things I've ever been to, and one of my favorite things that we host. But we've had to do it online for the last 2 years, which is not at all the same as sharing a space with hundreds of people. But that is a unique thing. There's very few art centers, I think, in the world that are capable. A, we don't have any neighbors. B, we're kind of on the edge of town. We're very lucky that way. We're not in the union. Doing a union job of 24 hours is insane. All that is that. But there's a lot more arts and culture, especially since New York City COVID exodus, like so many people in the arts and big money and big infrastructure. Arts are booming up here. When we came here, we really were one of the most progressive conceptual art centers in the whole area. There was not a lot of this outside of New York City. So we're also sensing just like, well, times are changing. There's like little indie art centers everywhere. There's big money museum things opening everywhere. Yeah. We don't really have to carry that anymore. We want to go to this next place, which is how do you connect people and the planet in a place that has made its mark with its historic beauty, but also its avant-garde art programming in the last decade. So that's been my current sort of exploration of this project, and I'm really, really excited about it because it's brand new territory as well. I'm not in education, I'm not in community engagement, or that's not where my background is at all. So it's exciting because we get to partner and outsource to people who come from a more altruistic place of engagement, community education, science, technology. The arts is often seen, as we all know, as a luxury to people. It's like, those who do not have time to explore arts, culture, entertainment. It's a very, it's exciting for me to shift from an art background and from an art center into a more place for the people and all people.
Well, and that beautiful statement of like location as teacher, I was thinking about the book Braiding Sweetgrass and like how that ties to what you were talking about in the same location of even like tying back to like, where are you and how does that inform you, and how we all actually a line from Wet Hot American Summer of we're all on spaceship Earth, like,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, to accept the responsibility for our actions is not in a punitive way where it's like, yes, we do need to accept the responsibility of the actions of industrialization, but also in accepting that we can accept the responsibility for actions to heal, like that. It's like,
Yes,
it's
exactly.
thing.
Yeah.
It's not, yeah, it's not like just bonking people in the head with a stick, because that makes people hopeless. um and so
Yeah.
using art and location and inspiration to help people actually help the planet we're living on, as opposed to
And
shaming.
inspire them to,
Yeah,
like it's inspiring them of like, look how cool and creative this is. What a
yeah,
cool thing. This old factory, we reclaimed it. And if you like just seal up the cracks and bring in this technology, all of a sudden you're like not burning fossil fuels, but people can gather in it. Yeah, it's a very exciting way to like teach how you can connect and not make this outrageous, daunting thing, which is climate catastrophe, a thing that just shuts people down, because people are just shutting down because it's terrifying because you think you can't do anything. But I've been sort of musing with like this idea of like how the arts, creativity, and climate resolving or climate healing can, it's like making your compost bin like a ritual act of love, making, sounds out of industrial scrap, like it just like this idea of like making your life a ritual by being aware of how you spend your energy, how you, it's becoming almost like a conceptual art if you let it be that. So I've been trying to figure out how to like tell that story too of conceptual, well, basically creative practices and creative minds can help combat climate crisis. It can, like literally, if we take that energy of these things that you and I were talking about, of receiving and morphing and changing your world around you based on what it needs. I mean, if we all tapped in like that, we would just naturally start curbing our habits. We would be, and that should be part of like a beautiful act of change, not a compromise, I mean, of course, I understand people like to travel, people need to drive. There's all these, but if you put your mind to it, maybe you won't want to travel and drive so much if you're thinking and feeling the consequence. It's like all has to start in a creative mindscape, really.
Yes, and to create different ways of doing things and to spend time. I love that you said like living life as a creative ritual, where it's like at each turn you can make a choice and you can actually be mindful of that choice. And it doesn't mean that all of your choices have to have some sort of level of virtue to them, but like
exactly
to have an awareness around them. And so if you do choose to fly somewhere, like choose wisely and judiciously.
Yeah.
Like,
and then like even counterbalance it, not with shame and guilt or whatever, but like then do something on the other side that is an act of like preservation or, kind of like, it's just being aware of our impacts, just like we need to be aware of what other people's feelings in the way that we, navigate the world. Like you don't want to hurt people's feelings. You want to try to be a good person. Doesn't mean, unless you're like raised in like a shame-based culture, but if you're just raised in a decent human being way, you will naturally sort of just align with a more harmonious way to live on this planet.
Yeah, it's much. Someone asked me where my positivity came from. I was at an outdoor gathering talking about psychology and polyamory and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
Like one does when one lives in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
I was like, the scans. But it was funny because like I'd gone in the house to use the restroom, and then I was walking out, and this person said, "You just have such positivity about you," and they were like, "You seem genuinely like engaged and joyful," and like it was a lovely thing for someone to say to me. But they said, "How do you do that?" And I paused because I was like, "What?" It was an unusual question,
right? Never.
And I just said, I was like, "Well, of course negative things happen. Of course stressful things happen. Like, of course there are things that, affect me, but it takes so much more energy to be mean or to be shut down or to be spiteful. I was just like, it is my natural tendency, I guess, to be positive and joyful. And I was just like, I hadn't thought about it though. And it's that where it's just like, if you start on that path, it feels good. So you keep doing it. Like that it doesn't become just choice of like time to be nice to people. Like it just.
No, I know. I have to say that too. In my years in the rock bands, just so much like darkness and depression and competition. And I always used to just say it's so much easier to be nice than mean. I don't understand where they get that energy from. So, yeah, but I do think it's also, again, a matter of how you're raised, and our energy and positivity or light was preserved growing. Some people don't have that luck of the draw, and they have terrible things that happen to them when they're young, and it taps the resource. Yeah.
So it's showing them like, hey, here's more resource. We can help you out. Like, come over here. Yeah. I just thought of, by the way, my brain was like, oh my gosh, we get to have a bat mitzvah for the Basilica. And I was like, what a weird thought, Pam.
That's a good idea. Yeah, I know. I have 2%, according to 23andMe, 2% Jewish.
Not for me.
I guess I could try. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much. You've been so generous with your time. I just wanted to thank you for that, for talking about all of this.
Pleasure. Totally lovely to have open, free range conversation about from the abstract to how easy it is to see the beauty in the light.
Yeah.
And make things a creative problem to solve versus a reactive thing to fight against. Change is good. Yeah.
Change is frightening and we love it.
Yes.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of Why Not Both? If you liked what you heard, please make sure to like us and subscribe to us on your preferred podcast platform. You can also come hang out with us on social media. We are at WNB the podcast, both on Instagram and on Twitter. This season, we are brought to you by Under the Radar magazine. Under the Radar is a nationally distributed print, music, and entertainment magazine and website. You can find them at www.undertheradarmag.com and feel free to support them on Patreon. Extra special thanks to our producer, Laura Studeris, who is literally a rock star. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you next episode.